One of Disneyland's earliest attractions was the Skyway. Built a year after the park's grand opening, it was a gondola ride, a pioneering ride system, the first of its kind in the country, taking guests high above the gradually emerging Fantasyland and Tomorrowland, a very popular part of early Disneyland, quickly becoming one of the classic Disney attractions, and a ride that soon found itself arriving at Disney World and later the company's first international project in Japan. But despite how much of a key part of Disneyland it wasn't able to achieve the permanence of some of the other icons of the park, closing in the 90s in all of its locations, with large parts of it ending up abandoned for many years in both Disneyland and Disney World, and today a largely forgotten part of the Disney skyline. I want to take a look at the history of Disney's Skyways, their evolution over the years, the abandoned remnants, some of which still persist today, and the legacy of Disney's iconic lost attraction. When Disneyland first opened in 1955, the park in Southern California still had a lot of work that needed doing. While it may have been an exceptional feat for the time, and a location that would completely change the world of amusement parks and theme parks forever, it was also a project that had been incredibly rushed. Built in just 1 year and a day, the park was lacking across most of its themed lands. Rides like the canal boats of the world were little more than slow boat rides past undecorated banks of dirt. The island in the center of the Rivers of America was an empty construction of grass and dirt, and attractions like the stagecoach and pack mule treks through Frontierland could equally be described as slow journeys through barren expanses of dirt. Disneyland in 1955 was truthfully a lot of dirt. And perhaps the best example of the emptiness of early Disneyland was the transition between Tomorrowland and Fantasyland in the northeast section of the park, an area that didn't contain any attractions at all. Leftover space for potential future expansions. If this whole theme park thing worked out, this part of the park was currently being used for, what do you know, more dirt. Specifically, the dirt that was dug up during the construction of the moat surrounding Sleeping Beauty Castle, left there with some minor landscaping to give the 20-foot mound a more natural look. In 1955, Disney named this particular mound of dirt Holiday Hill, actually the location of a planned land named Holidayland, which would have featured small town amenities like a picnic spot and a baseball diamond. A land which did end up being built a few years later, but was instead placed elsewhere beyond the Disneyland berm. Holiday Hill was initially fenced off from guests. There is some debate about the exact order of events, but from what I've read, it seems that soon after opening day, frequent fence jumpings from teenage couples looking for a place to hide away prompted Disney to add pathways, shrubbery, and benches to the area to encourage guests to the top for a view over Disneyland, turning the hill into a sort of attraction itself. As 1956 arrived, Disneyland would begin to fill out some of those areas it had left half-finished its opening year. Tomorrowland would receive the first iteration of its spinning rocket ride, the Astrojets. The island in the center of the Rivers of America would become Tom Sawyer Island. The dirt trails of Frontierland would be transformed into the much improved living desert. And the empty area near Holiday Hill would gain a new attraction too. Walt Disney had recently discovered Swiss company Von Roll's new cable cars, or aerial ropeway, small gondolas they'd been developing to take passengers into the Swiss Alps. Walt Disney loved all things transportation. He mainly loved trains. Lots and lots of trains. But this too. And excited by the idea of putting an aerial ropeway in Disneyland, he immediately bought the ride system from Von Roll and enlisted the company to work alongside his Imagineers to bring it to his new theme park. The Von Roll gondolas were to run from the edge of Tomorrowland across to the other side of Fantasyland, providing guests an aerial view of a large part of the park in the same way as the existing Disneyland Railroad. And conveniently, the leftover dirt of Holiday Hill would prove central in accentuating the new ride, as one of these support poles could be placed on top of the hill, taking passengers much higher over Disneyland. The Von Roll ride system would have a very basic look. The undecorated poles placed along the route were purely functional, and the ride vehicles themselves would be simple, coloured metal buckets with 2 seats bolted to the floor. But to give the ride some sense of theme, the 2 stations at either end of its route would be stylized after their respective lands. The Tomorrowland station given a similar futuristic look typical of the 1950s, and in fitting with the homeland of its manufacturers, the station in Fantasyland would be a decorative Swiss chalet. Lastly, the Von Roll 101 aerial ropeway would be given a much simpler name, and instead, promotional posters went up announcing the opening of the new Disneyland Skyway. The Skyway would welcome its first guests on June 23, 1956. Just a week after the opening of Tom Sawyer Island began a summer of expansion at Disneyland. Guests could board from either Tomorrowland or Fantasyland. The 2 directions were counted as 2 separate attractions, and with this being the era of ticket books at Disneyland, they both required a separate ticket to ride, although a round-trip ticket could be purchased as well. Boarding from Tomorrowland, guests would first ascend over the new Astrojets and the Phantom Boats, the motorboat attraction in a small lagoon in the northern part of Tomorrowland, with boats that were famously constantly overheating and breaking down. In fact, in a film that was shot at Disneyland that year, you can even see what looks like guests struggling to get their boats going again in the middle of the lagoon. Anyway, moving on from the Phantom boats and their Phantom functional engines, the Skyway would then ascend even further above Tomorrowland to its highest points, as it flew over Holiday Hill and began the transition into Fantasyland. Fantasyland was a lot more complete than Tomorrowland in 1956. Guests could spot the canal boats of the world, which had very recently had miniature buildings, and the soon-to-become iconic model of Monstro the Whale added to its route, and had reopened as the Storybook Land canal boats. They would then pass over the Chicken of the Sea restaurant, the massive pirate ship dominating this part of the land, and the Casey Jr. circus train and the Mad Tea Party. Finally, they could get a look down into the Dumbo flying elephants before they would sight the Swiss chalet, standing on top of a hill separating Fantasyland from Frontierland, where their gondola would pull into the station to end their trip across Disneyland. While the Skyway may seem unremarkable today, it was the first ride of its kind to open in the United States, and would become a very popular part of early Disneyland. It provided great aerial views of Tomorrowland and Fantasyland, and it was one of a number of attractions from the time that, rather than being standalone experiences, weaved their way into the rest of their area, adding to the living feeling of the park. Its aerial views did break some of Disneyland's self-imposed rules of controlling guests' sightlines, but this didn't seem to bother guests. The Disneyland Skyway would operate for a little over a year in its original form, until late 1957, when it would be temporarily closed to facilitate the construction of the park's next major expansion. Holiday Hill was, of course, a quick fix for a park rushing to open, and so, not long into its life, Walt Disney had discussed plans with his Imagineers to replace the hill with a snowy mountain to house a toboggan ride. Walt had originally wanted real snow, but after being convinced that this just wasn't feasible for Southern California, the plan evolved into a candy mountain, and eventually some form of wild mouse coaster with fake snow instead. It wouldn't be until Walt Disney went to the Swiss Alps to check on the filming of the movie Third Man on the Mountain that he would realise what Holiday Hill should become, and his Imagineers back in California would receive a postcard of the Matterhorn mountain, with 2 words written on the back: "Build this." And so, in 1959, when the newest part of Disneyland was ready to open, it would feature a new lagoon housing the submarine voyage, the first ever Disneyland monorail, and a 147-foot recreation of the Matterhorn, home to the world's first ever tubular steel roller coaster. The full story of the Matterhorn bobsleds is perhaps one for another time. But as far as the Skyway was concerned, it also provided a fantastic opportunity to further integrate the attraction into its surroundings. As rather than going up and over Holiday Hill, the Skyway would now travel directly through the Matterhorn, providing riders of both attractions views of one another as they went past. It also helped that both rides were Swiss themed, as they looked as if Disney had planned it that way all along. The next change for the Skyway would come in 1965. The original gondolas had a central pole sticking right between the two seats, and they were a little difficult to get in and out of. That year, a new design would be introduced by Disney Imagineer Bob Gurr, using a mixture of steel and plastic to create colourful cable cars, now with room for up to 4 passengers. Interestingly, these new vehicles were added gradually, and for a short time, both the original and new ones could be seen on the ride. As Disneyland entered its second decade of operation, the Skyway provided a great vantage point for guests to see the park's continued growth. In 1967, the year after the passing of Walt Disney, Tomorrowland received a grand redesign. And among new dark rides and the Carousel of Progress, the land received the Goodyear People Mover, another transportation-based attraction with a very similar vehicle design to the new Skyway cars, and guests could wave to each other from the two rides. In 1971, the Skyway turned 15 years old. That year would be one of the most significant in Disney's history, as the company would open Walt Disney World on the other side of the country in Florida. The resort would initially open with just one park, Magic Kingdom, a castle-based park just like Disneyland, featuring many similar attractions cloned or adapted from its predecessor. Naturally, the Skyway would be one of these attractions. The Disney World Skyway would have a slightly longer route, with the gondolas going through a turning point partway through, above where its version of Autopia was, renamed the Grand Prix Raceway. But for the most part, the Disney World Skyway would provide guests with similar views of its versions of Tomorrowland and Fantasyland. Submarine Voyage would instead be themed to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and there would be no Matterhorn to travel through. But Dumbo, the Mad Tea Party, and the Carousel were all represented. Back at Disneyland, in 1978, the Matterhorn would receive its own update. The interior, which had been relatively open, would have new ice caverns added, and the first semblance of a story would be brought to the ride, with the introduction of the abominable snowman, who lurked within the mountain, hunting riders. 3 separate animatronics that appeared in various scenes as the bobsleds flew past. As a result of the changes, the Skyway's views within the Matterhorn were slightly more restricted, but guests could now see and hear the monster in one of the scenes as they rode through the mountain, adding what was sort of the Skyway's first and only show scene at Disneyland. Another significant change to the Skyway's views would happen 5 years later in 1983, with the opening of New Fantasyland, a renovation of Fantasyland, removing the pirate ship, relocating Dumbo, the Carousel, and the Mad Tea Party, and adding new dark rides. The land was also rethemed as a Bavarian village, which now made it an even closer match to the similar alpine themes of the Skyway and Matterhorn. But the more important change for the Disney parks that year would be their first international theme park, as in April, Tokyo Disneyland would open in Japan, a park owned and operated by the third-party Oriental Land Company, but designed by Disney. Largely a recreation of Magic Kingdom in Florida, with elements of Disneyland thrown in. The park would feature a similar Cinderella castle to the one in Florida, as well as a Haunted Mansion and Space Mountain, a Frontierland, now called Western Land, and of course, its own Skyway. A pre-opening map shows that the Tokyo Skyway was originally supposed to have an almost identical route to the one in Magic Kingdom. However, it seems that at some point during development, this was cut back, and the version of the attraction that opened in Japan instead just travelled in a much shorter straight line past the Grand Circuit Raceway, a reduction of the views offered back in America. The gondolas were also fully enclosed for the first time. In the mid to late 80s, the Skyway was even planned for a fourth location, as Disney set its sights on Europe. The upcoming Euro Disneyland park, to open outside of Paris by the early 90s, was to feature a modified version of Tomorrowland named Discoveryland, themed to the writings of French science fiction author Jules Verne. And early models and concept art of the land included a Skyway crisscrossing overhead, with new gondolas made to look like Zeppelin airships. Rather than an A to B journey, the ride would have been a round-trip tour of the land from above, much like the other Tomorrowlands had the People Mover. However, the Paris Skyway never made it past the concept stage, and Disney would never build any more Skyway rides within their parks. In the 1990s, the Disney parks found themselves under increasing pressure to modernize and to introduce more exciting, thrill-based attractions. Pressure brought on mainly by the company's then CEO, Michael Eisner, who had set out plans for the Disney Decade, a 10-year run of ambitious new projects across the whole company. In 1994, one of these projects would arrive at Magic Kingdom, with the opening of Disney World's new Tomorrowland, adding several new attractions, some of which I've covered in previous videos on my channel, and changing the land's theme to that of an alien spaceport. As Disney World guests rode towards the new Tomorrowland, they would now see the spires of Astro Orbiter come into view from their Skyway gondolas. But what they could no longer see on their trip were the Nautilus submarines of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, as it would close in Fantasyland in September, leaving a notably empty lagoon beneath them. And on the other side of the country, on December 9th, the Disneyland Skyway would suddenly close after 38 years of operation. Speculation about the exact reason why such a classic attraction had closed began immediately, with the most common rumour being that Disney had been forced to close the Skyway because of a serious incident that had occurred earlier that year. In April, a 30-year-old man had fallen from his gondola into a tree near the Alice in Wonderland ride. He then tried to sue Disney for the incident, and many people assumed that this accident had sparked safety concerns that had caused the unexpected closure. However, he later admitted that he actually jumped deliberately. There was another similar incident at Disney World too, where in 1982, as the ride was being restarted after a weather closure, a cast member was pushed out of the Fantasyland station by a moving vehicle and left dangling 35 feet in the air. She lost her grip on the vehicle, falling onto a roof below, injuring her back, but surviving the incident. But aside from an evacuation in 1983 after high winds, the Disneyland Skyway had no genuine major incidents that could have led to its closure. The reality, or at least the most widely accepted explanation for why the Skyway closed, was that cracks had formed where the ride supports connected to the inside of the Matterhorn, and that these would be too expensive to fix. Essentially, such an old ride at Disneyland was falling apart. There are several other explanations that have been given over the years. One is that with that modernization push in the 90s, the Skyway was seen as not being exciting enough for the Disney Decade. Cable cars were no longer a novelty, and in fact, many other parks and other tourist spots had opened very similar attractions that turned the Skyway into one of many, rather than a standout Disney experience. In the book The Disneyland Story by Sam Genoway, Imagineer Tony Baxter is quoted as saying that the closure was simply a cost-cutting measure, With the 1995 opening of Indiana Jones' Temple of the Forbidden Eye in Adventureland, management at the time was of the mindset that every ride opening should be accompanied by a ride closing to offset costs. And so the Skyway was sacrificed. This idea also makes sense when you consider that by 1994, Disney was reeling financially from the terrible opening of Euro Disneyland, which forced cancellations and cutbacks across nearly everything that came out of the rest of the 90s and beyond. The same book also claims that Imagineers did propose a new, upgraded version of the Skyway, with larger 6-person, fully enclosed gondolas now going around the Matterhorn, and with a third station at Critter Country to extend the route. But this idea never ended up happening. And the Disneyland story also claims that the ride no longer met the new safety standards for aerial tramways, and the accessibility laws would have required the stations to install elevators and make the gondolas wheelchair accessible, something that Disney felt wasn't feasible. I think in this way, it is kind of fair to say that a big reason why the Disneyland Skyway closed was that it was too dangerous. It's just not in the sense that people think. There weren't verifiable incidents, more that it was too dangerous from a more boring, legislative, bureaucratic perspective. Disney executives were concerned about the potential for something to happen. That section in the book I've just referenced is titled with a quote about the Skyway from Disneyland president Jack Lindquist, "An accident waiting to happen." Soon after the closure, the support towers that had been a prominent site since 1956 were removed, and the tunnel through the Matterhorn was partially covered up. In Tokyo, the shorter enclosed Skyway remained open for another 4 years, but in 1998, it also closed to make way for Pooh's Honey Hunt, and all of the remnants of that Skyway were completely removed from the park. The final operating Skyway was the one at Walt Disney World, now travelling over a drastically different Magic Kingdom than the one it had originally been built over. With the closure of the other two, its days were clearly numbered. And unfortunately, in 1999, the Disney World Skyway would be the site of a tragic incident. In February, a cast member named Raymond Barlow was knocked out of the Fantasyland station after the ride was switched back on before the park's opening that morning. In a very similar scenario to the accident in 1982, he held onto the gondola that had collided with him, but ended up falling 40 feet, sadly dying from his injuries. Disney World received a $4,500 fine for violating safety codes as a result of the accident, and whether or not this was the exact thing to do it, in November, the last of Disney's Skyways would permanently close. Just like at Disneyland, the cables and support towers were removed from the park very soon after the closure. The Disneyland Tomorrowland station was also demolished, aside from a set of stairs near the People Mover. But in both parks, the stations in Fantasyland were left standing. In Disney World, the Tomorrowland station was also left intact, closed off from guests, now acting as a generic but inaccessible building in the land. The water feature on the side of the station was still active, and the space where gondolas would enter and exit was clearly visible. The building did still serve a purpose though, as the restrooms on the ground floor were still operational. Disney World's Fantasyland station also continued as a generic piece of theming for the land. The area in front of it was used for stroller parking and some character meet and greets, but the large building itself was completely closed. Disneyland's Fantasyland station was initially expected to be transformed into a dining area, an expansion to the opposite Village House quick service restaurant, but this never came to fruition, and after the Skyway's closure, the staircase leading up to it was roped off, and the trees surrounding the building were allowed to grow out, covering much of the old station from view. After a few years, it became apparent that the stations at both sites had become effectively abandoned, hidden in plain sight, some very plain sight, in the middle of the world's busiest theme parks. I would normally criticize this type of abandonment, but leaving these buildings like this kind of made sense. The Swiss chalets fit into the theme of Fantasyland well enough that all demolishing them would achieve would be a shrinking of the land. And so while it would have been better if Disney had replaced them with a new attraction, it wasn't as big a deal as some of the later abandonments that Disney would allow in the coming years, like River Country and the Wonders of Life Pavilion. Of course, being abandoned locations in a Disney theme park, as the 21st century approached, it wouldn't be long before the Skyway stations started drawing the attention of Disney's urban explorers. Although, not to the extent that you might expect. I think a combination of low interest in the buildings compared to those other sites, combined with just how exposed they were in their respective parks, made them a far less common target. People would very occasionally venture past the roped-off staircases to stick a camera through the window, and many more typical, non-trespassing fans took pictures of the stations from guest-accessible areas, documenting their decay. But images inside the stations were exceedingly rare, and the small number of times they did appear online, they were actually taken with permission. By 2008, photos emerged showing the inside the Disneyland chalet, revealing that while it wasn't in the best state, it wasn't quite as abandoned as some had suggested. Temporary tables showing the area was actively being used by Disney cast members. Photos posted by the Imagineering Disney blog in 2010 from a trip taken inside the Magic Kingdom chalet 2 to 3 years earlier showed a much worse looking station. The queue line still intact, but the walls and floor covered in grime. Finally, in 2009, after 10 years of sitting empty, steps were taken to remove the Disney World stations, as the Tomorrowland building had its top floor demolished, but its ground floor restrooms were left behind, becoming their own standalone building. And the chalet in Fantasyland was torn down too, with a new set of restrooms and a tower themed to the movie Tangled built in its place, opening in 2013 as part of the new Fantasyland expansion for the park. The Fantasyland station in Disneyland would remain behind the trees until the mid-2010s, when Disney announced the construction of the new Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, to be built in the northwest of the park beyond Frontierland. And as part of the construction, the station, which had stood for 60 years, was demolished in 2016, and the last major part of any of Disney's Skyway attractions disappeared from the parks for good. While all of those major parts of the Skyway attractions are now gone, today there are still some smaller remnants of the classic attraction at both Disneyland and Disney World. The remnants at Disney World are very minor. Mainly, the restroom building still exists, and if you look at the shape of the building from above, it's clear how it was designed with the route of the Skyway in mind. At Disneyland, the staircase in Tomorrowland on the side of the old Carousel of Progress building still exists, as does the staircase that once led guests up to the Swiss chalet in Fantasyland. And while they have been covered up to make them look more natural, the tunnels through the Matterhorn are still pretty visible. Speaking of the Matterhorn, in 2015, the ride was refurbished again with new additions like an improved animatronic, and a new scene showing items left from previous failed expeditions to the mountain, like several crashed bobsleds and the remains of an old 50s Skyway gondola, a nod to the former attraction. Lastly, in 2019, the Skyway would resurface once again in a different way, as Disney World would debut the Skyliner, not a ride within their parks, but a transportation system between their parks. A multi-stop, multi-route network connecting some of the resort's hotels to Hollywood Studios and Epcot in much larger 8-person, fully enclosed cars. It's not quite the same thing, but in a way it does serve as an evolution of the transportation system Walt Disney's impulse purchase in 1956 was originally supposed to be. From a modern perspective, the Skyway may have been a pretty boring attraction. It had no story, no real theming or show scenes that were its own, and the ride experience itself was basic. I've already mentioned that it was a novel experience in the 50s, but beyond that time period, I think the Skyway still served an important role in its respective parks. I've spoken before on the channel a few times now about my love for meta attractions. Attractions that, rather than existing in their own bubble, are integrated within the land. serving as a kind of texture for the area to accentuate everything around it. I've explained this concept in more detail in my Rocket Rods video, but in a similar way to things like the People Mover and the Railroad, the Skyway was deeply integrated into the park itself, going through and around other things as a way of introducing guests to the park more broadly. And I think the other thing that's special about the Skyway that I wanted to mention was that it didn't actually change that much over its lifetime. Rather, the park changed around it. And that made it a great way to view the progression of Disneyland. When I wrote this video, I wanted to include all of those stories about the attractions that changed around it, because I want to show that with a ride whose whole purpose is to view the rest of the park, it is that ever-changing view and the gradual emergence of modern Disneyland that is central to its experience. The Skyway is also very interesting to think about, because while it has now been gone for so long, there was a time when the gondolas flying over the park was as iconic a Disneyland site as the Carousel, or Big Thunder Mountain, or Dumbo, or any of these other core elements that are taken for granted as being typical of a Disney theme park. Do you have any memories of the Disney Skyway? If you rode it at any of its locations, or even if you never got the chance to experience it, let me know what you think about the Skyway in the comments. A massive thank you to my Patreon members for supporting the creation of this video and all the other videos on my channel. If you want to support the channel on Patreon and access exclusive bonus content, like my most recent video covering what the best year to visit Disney World was, you can check that out at the link in the description. Other than that, if you're new here, please consider hitting subscribe, as there are plenty more videos about theme parks coming in the future, and as always, I'll see you next time.